Hello, good evening. Welcome to the HAU and welcome to our second session in our discursive series on violence, a discursive series that is a joint venture between Akademie der Künste der Welt and namely Max Hinderer, my colleague and good friend, and the HAU Hebbel am Ufer and me here as the theory curator. I would have said today that I am delighted to open the second chapter of our series with DENISE FERREIRA da Silva, Fred Moten, and Stefano Harney. And you see that DENISE FERREIRA da Silva is not here. DENISE FERREIRA da Silva had a 3 times delighted flight today and got stuck in the border control in the German Flughafen airport. In a way, if you want, is a nice fitting irony. I was thinking, fun fact, all incomplete, right? Is an incomplete panel. And this gives me actually, to be honest with you, in a way, a force to be spontaneous tonight and see what happens in this all incompleteness. You see Fred also in the back. Yes, I'm still delighted that we're here today with Stefano and Fred, because of course it is a rare opportunity, I think, to listen to people that not only are very precise, but also very playful and are very empowering by performing new or other modalities of writing. And these other modalities of writing force me, at least, to have other modalities of reading, even. I think that's a wonderful practice or exercise for us to think how we then also can have another modality of thinking. And they're also here because we thought, of course, that they resonate a lot with what we want to do with the violence series and also with what we did in the first session of the series with Elsa Dorland. And we, and also Max, we want to take some threads of it and bring it also here. So you might have seen that we had Elsa Dorland in our program, and there what comes to mind is, of course, the question of self-defense. We talked about the act of self-defense of the subjugated body always considered as unjustified violence, while the violent acts of the state, for example, are considered as justified protection of the given order, right? So the act of self-defense of a racialized body is kind of always already unjustified because it's always already a threat to the given order. What other comes to mind when we try to interweave Dorland's last session with today is her interrogation of patriarchal violence, that she doesn't not see as an isolated violence, an unfortunate accident of civilized modernity, but as part of a continuum of forms of violence, of colonial violence, extractivist violence, capitalist economic violence, and their mutual reinforcements, right? A continuum of violence that, as we know, and was historically complicit to the making of man, with capital M, to the making of the modern subject, to the making of the conception of the body as inscribed by the arsenal of scientific reason. And all of this is, of course, also something that our speakers have been writing on. They have been writing on the genealogy of enlightenment and Western epistemology as linked to racial differences, racial subjugation, and thus as linked to and thus an epistemology that is linked to the deployment of a systemic violence. So this is more or less the field that we have been navigating until now. And what Harney and Moten were saying in the video that you might have seen, you might know that this series is a quite complicated format. People also don't understand it so well. It has a video as a first part of a discussion with a speaker or with our speakers. The second part is the discussion. The third part is a publication. So there has been a video where we talked with Stefano and Fred, and what they said is that we have to rethink what we call violence in the first place. They are suggesting in the videos to rather speak of a reactive brutality than of violence. A brutality as a regulatory imposition of the morality of the individuum, an imposition of the modern self, and its sexist and racial determination. And as a consequence, as far as I understood, there's here a dilemma of how we can resist violence without taking on the conceptual apparatus and language that are at the heart of this regulatory brutalization. Another consequence or question I thought to hear is that we cannot only denounce or impose justice upon the perpetrators of violence, but we would need to resist the conditions of possibility of violence itself. And these are things that I'm curious about to know more. And yes, we were thinking about leaving Fred, Denise, and Stefano to talk among themselves, because of course they're poets, they're thinkers, they're artists, musicians, filmmakers, and maybe to also, you know, let the speech act of them resonate in the room. Yeah, now we will see how we will do it without Denise, and what will emerge. Yes, I will give over to Max.
Thank you, Margarita. Hello? Can you hear me? Yes. All right. Thank you, Margarita, for the introductory words. It's on me to welcome everyone again on this wonderful early summer evening. Nice you showed up here. And thanks to our guests to make the way here and, you know, try to make the way here. Thanks a lot to Fred for joining us through video from New York. I would like to ask the technique, please, to put Fred for us on the monitor so we don't have to turn around. Thank you. And we still keep our hopes up. Denise Ferreira da Silva will make it to join us. It will remain, yes, a surprise effect for us. So in order to introduce our guests, first I'd like to introduce Stefano Harney, sitting here to my left. Stefano is a lecturer and author who works collaboratively and collectively in teaching, research, and social practice. He has been teaching in universities in the United States as well as universities in the United Kingdom, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Singapore, and is currently professor for transversal aesthetics at the Media Art School, KHM, Kunsthochschule für Medien in Cologne. In 2021, he was Haydn Fellow and visiting critic at the Yale University's School of Art, and he was honorary professor at the Institute of Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia. Welcome, Stefano. On the screen, through the video live conference with us from New York, Fred Moten. Fred is a teacher and writer. His areas of work span from Black literature, oral to visual culture, critical theory, performance study, and poetry and poetics. He's particularly concerned with the social power and social origins of Black expressive culture practices. And Fred studied at Harvard, where he actually met with Stefano, and holds a PhD from the University of Berkeley in California. Both Stefano and Fred have each of them published widely and as individual authors and within author collectives. Tonight, we'd like to highlight 2 co-authored books by them that have gained quite some critical acclaim, I guess it's fair to say, during the last years. First, the Undercommons, Fugitive Planning Black Study, published in 2013, and most recently, which is last year, All Incomplete, both published by Minor Compositions and Autonomedia. In them, Stefano and Fred have renewed, we could say, the critical discourse on the community, the common, and the subject, and developed alternative forms of thinking that collectivity, collective alternative forms of learning, and one would like to say also of unlearning. Welcome, Fred from New York. Well, as I said, hopefully Denise will still make it. We'll have the chance to speak with her when she arrives, hopefully. But let's start with some questions. This format, Margarita already explained, consists of several parts, and we're happy to find ourselves here together with an audience and with the possibility of getting into a dialogue. So the format tonight is of, getting into a talk together with Fred and Stefano, and soon pass over also the mic to the audience and give you the chance who are present tonight to ask questions, to engage in the conversation. So first of all, I'd like to highlight something that actually not only Fred and Stefano's practice, that characterizes it in relation to the topic of violence, but also the practice of Denise Ferreira da Silva, which is some way of dealing with a topic that has been crucial and central since our first session called On Violence 1 that took place with French philosopher Elsa. That is a question about the so-called incommensurability of the experience of violence, right? When we were talking with Elsa, and Elsa in her book on self-defense was talking about this incommensurability of the experience of violence, and in her talk on violence talked about the incommensurability of the experience of violence. We figured out, and this is something we discussed in a reading group that is accompanying these lecture series, that it's a crucial question to think about, how can we actually grasp the experience of violence? And I would say that in Fred's, in Stefano's, and in Denise's work, there's 2 registers one could think of, or one can identify 2 registers to think or rethink violence, and specifically racialized violence, that characterize your approaches. I, dare to identify 2 of them. First, there's a structural approach, one that thinks of violence as a constitutive structural element of liberal and neoliberal economy. So there's a hidden, right, contradiction, which I think is very fruitful, and that is to think about incommensurability and try to use parameters of rethinking economics in order to speak about this incommensurability of the experience of violence. And secondly, we have an approach that is bound to the use of poetry or poetics, or to recur to poetics, also music, as a register that can somehow capture an analysis of violence without falling for or subjugating to the dominant norms of representation and or the dominant modern and colonial epistemologies that situate the subject as a human or considered human individual. For example, I would like to ask you, Fred and Stefano, can you say something about those 2 approaches present in your work? Where do they come from?
Oh, thank you, Max. Thank you, Margarita. Thank you all for being here this evening. It's the first time I'm back in Berlin since the pandemic, and I'm probably the case for some of you as well, that life's changed, but it's nice to see some old friends here, and I'm very grateful that you've allowed us to be part of this series. I know for sure that if Denise had any way to make it, she would have been here with us. So, as I said to one of our mutual friends, the good thing is we know she's in Berlin. So, hopefully we'll see her in other ways and in other times if we don't see her now. This was an unusual format for us, but welcome, because it was something different. And it is something different. It was also unusual because we can't normally stick to a subject, and you had us stick into violence. So in order to do that, we kind of anchored it to a bunch of different places where violence was implicit, but probably less available in our work than our attention to brutality, which often shows up in our work really, partly to remind of the context and the conditions of what we're looking for and what we're looking to. I have to think about the way you characterized our work, so I'm going to propose a slightly different start, which then Fred can kind of jump in on, if you will. In our sort of more recent conversations together and our chances to talk to people, and as I say talk to you, I wanted just to say we're very happy to be interrupted. So if you feel like you want to interrupt at any point, you don't have to wait. We welcome it, and we're happy if you do that. And in a way, that's exactly the kind of violence that we're going to try to talk about, even though that sounds funny right now. I think in the more recent work we've been doing, we've got increasingly sort of obsessed with the problem of individuation. But also what's happened is that we started to realize that individuation is not, doesn't just happen to individuals. Individuation happens to works of art. Individuation happens to nation states. Individuation happens to, academic disciplines. And what it has in common in each of those cases is brutality. Is a brutal reduction of something to the one. And at the same time, we've been thinking about the ways in which we might want to use the word violence separately from that brutality, to indicate a way in which the work that we do to help each other out of this individuation can be violent. And by violent, we're really talking about a kind of violence at the level of our being, and how we think of our being, and how we even consider ourselves as having being. A lot of what we're trying to explore calls that into question. And if you're holding on to that in various ways, those questions can feel like a kind of violence. And I mean that just in the very basic way of, it can make you feel like you're falling apart. It can make you feel like you're going to pieces. If you really begin to question that kind of hold, that grasp, as you were saying, that you're trying to have on your being. And both being and having come into this formula very much. And whether or not we can give those up may be, in many ways, a question of violence. And that's part of the reason that we are sometimes making a distinction, as we did in the video, between brutality, which is the reactive force brought to bear on our practices of escaping individuation, both at the level of our problem of person, but also at the level of the state, the level of global economy, anywhere where this brutality insists on identity, where it insists on the one. So, coming back to what I perceived in your question, we think that what could be understood as structural and understood in the other register are actually linked problems of where individuation occurs, and therefore where we see the brutality that makes individuation and the brutality that reacts to any attempt to escape it, or any attempt to live differently. We can't really see each other, so I should probably say, like, over to you or something corny, right?
Well, I would like to echo Stefano's thanks to Max and to Margarita, and I'll also echo his, sadness that Denise can't be here with us right now, because we're always looking forward to our opportunities to talk with her and to learn from her. And actually today I just heard a new book.
One moment. The sound is not really like that, that people can understand, Fred. Dear technicians. It's not a comment to you, friend, it's like to the technique. No? Can you give me a sign? Yeah, you want to continue?
Let's try.
Try.
Oh, okay. Well, the other thing that's kind of difficult is that you've got the screen. I can no longer see any of you. I just see myself.
Okay. Technicians, dear technicians, it would be nice to show Fred the stage. It's like this violence of falling apart, which we're experiencing. And I don't know if we should call it violence, but yeah, the falling apart takes place. Do you see us at the stage?
Yes,
okay,
I do.
Good. So now we continue. You were showing Denise's new book.
Yes, it's called Unpayable Debt, and it is a reading in large part of Octavia Butler's novel Kindred, but it's an extraordinary book, so I recommend it to everyone. Well, I think it's important to emphasize something that Stefano said earlier, which is that for the last few years, we've been interested in making a distinction between violence and brutality, or violence and regulatory brutality. And we see the regulatory brutality as a mode of individuation, as he says. We're interested in probably making a kind of argument for violence over against this regulatory brutality. And maybe a clue for doing this work has been sort of persistent way in which analyses of violence in the 20th century, with the possible exception of Walter Benjamin, but certainly Hannah Arendt, Frantz Fanon, Levinas, and others, their work is concerned with an interpretation of violence, but not so much with a description of violence, not even so much with a definition of it. There's a general assumption that violence means certain kinds of activities that cause harm to bodies. And there's a general consensus that it is something that occurs by way of the actions, sometimes of states, sometimes of military forces. Often it occurs by way of problematic individuals who engage in these forms of the sort of duress and disruption that is meted out upon individual bodies. It produces a kind of deficit when it comes to analyzing the forms of brutality that are meted out on populations. It's one of the reasons, violence is sometimes, I think, best understood as part of that general framework of what one might call crimes against humanity, or inhumane treatment of humans by humans, or man's inhumanity to man, those kinds of formulations. But the notion of an individual actor, as well as an individual victim, is usually assumed, so that it's unclear if those analyses of violence have it's unclear if those analyses of violence, provide a way for us to describe genocide, for instance. It's unclear, for instance, if genocide shows up as an analytic category in Hannah Arendt's book on violence. It's unclear if it could. By the same token, there are other elements of violence that wouldn't show up for her, it seems to me, like the kind of violence that is done to populations as a function of policy, the violence that might be meted out against populations and individuals, for that matter, when healthcare budgets are cut or when education budgets are cut. And then there are a whole range of other possible modalities of violence that, again, seem to escape those sort of analytic structures. And so I guess the beginning of our thinking has been we need to maybe engage in some more precise, not so much definitions, but maybe phenomenological descriptions of violence. And once you begin to engage in more precise phenomenological descriptions of violence, it turns out that on the one hand, yes, it gives you the possibility of accounting for forms of mass violence and for modes of non-militarized state violence that otherwise would not be taken into account. For instance, we can understand, say, segregation in the American South in the 1940s and 50s, as well as now, for that matter. We could understand those as forms of violence and even forms of state violence in ways that Hannah Arendt wasn't able to understand it as state violence. She was able to understand it as a mode of social choice. And by the same token, and this is even more both problematic but also interesting, there are other forms of violence that emerge that turn out to be not so much genocidal, not so much operating within the framework of other modalities of state-sponsored or state enacted violence, but those forms of violence that we might ordinarily associate with care or with love. The violence of an unwanted hug, okay? The violence of poorly expressed concern. The kinds of violence that tend to make individuals, as Stefano was intimating, fall apart rather than hold themselves together. And those forms of violence could even be conceived of as therapeutic. So what we wanted to try to do was to see if we could get a handle on those modes of violence too, and to begin to try to talk about those modes better. And that requires, again, more precise descriptions of the acts that are called violent. So that's kind of what we've been working on.
Yes, this is what you also explain in the video, that you say care is not an antidote of violence, it might be an antidote of violence. And this is, of course, highly interesting because we have a explosion of care discourses at the moment that really would see a world organized around care as maybe another world than today that is organized around accumulation and war, for example, right? What I think is interesting, I mean, if I understood correctly, you describe also what Denise actually calls a productive violence, right? That where through violence, a lot of things were made. You know, we said that the modern subject was made through violence, or if you look at feminist theory, the whole gender was made through violence, patriarchalization of the world, domestication of people with uteruses, forbidding polygamy, forcing people into nuclear marriages during colonization, etc. This also was a productive violence in the sense that it created gender as we know it, right? So this would be a question of mine, is this violence also in a way can we think of it as a productive violence? And then can we think of care as a negative care? And this is a term of Elsa Dorlin, actually, in her book, where she explicitly says, and it's one of the few feminists who actually do it, decolonial feminists, she explicitly says, care is not always, there is negative care, and the negative care is that you have to serve your master. You have to, and even if the master is your kid or your husband, right? And you have to read of the eyes of your husband or the king or someone you're serving, what they need before they even say it, right? She calls it negative care. Yeah, maybe you would like to comment on this.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I guess my question would be, how far would we have to go from this neighborhood in Berlin into the more bourgeois neighborhoods of Berlin before we find the perfect example of what you might call brutal care? How far would we go before we find women pushing strollers? How do you describe that? It's care. Often the woman loves the child, but it's complete brutality at the same time. So I think one of the things that Fred and I were just trying to think about is some of the problems of trying to put brutality on one side and care on the other, or what generally people are calling violence, but because we're digging into violence, as Fred was just doing so well, I'll just use brutality for the moment. What's the danger of thinking that the antidote to brutality is care? Well, the danger is that all these forms of care, which are completely bound up historically with brutality start to appear separate. Care becomes individuated. And as it becomes individuated, it becomes brutal, you know. So not only does it emerge from a very complicated relationship to it, but somewhere down the road, once care becomes this clean thing, it'll be a brutal thing, for sure, an individuated thing. So we're just trying to avoid that and think about, you know, as you're saying, the whole history of patriarchy is the imposition of brutal care, you know, and against what you might call the violence of sexual being, you know, which, you know, is violent in the sense is that it refuses the form of individuation, that it refuses many of the things that we take to be the reactions necessary, right? So, to put it in the most obvious way, right? The brutality visited upon you causes you to try to make the subject reaction, to say, this is my body, to say, I have rights. And what choice do we have? We have to do that, and some people have to do it a lot more than other people. And yet, it's the recapitulation of the brutality, you know? It's the rights-bearing subject that is the agent of the world's brutality. And so if we have to appeal to that, which we do, you know, we're also appealing to that ongoing problem. And that's one of the things that Fred and I are trying to think about, and we're trying to think about if you could make a distinction about certain kinds of violence at the level of being, at the level of having, that would provide you with, together, some sort of resource or recourse that, you know, you could call it, you can't call it anything because our language is so fucked up from individuation, but, you know, it would be a reimagining of some kind of collective self-defense.
Would you like to add something to that? Otherwise, I have a...
Me?
Yeah, otherwise I have a direct question to you.
No, I'm good.
On the video lecture, the video we are referring to frequently, which we recorded in Frankfurt, you, Fred, said a memorable sentence. I say memorable because it's what got stuck to my head the most of our conversation. I would like just to ask you about it because it's because it was, you know, within a longer stream of thought, and perhaps you could just reflect on it for our audience tonight here in Berlin. Making this distinction between brutality and violence, you try to explain, in order to make this distinction, you said brutality, for example, is what constitutes the modern subject as individual, and violence, on the other hand, is what messes it up. This is what you had said on the distinction of brutality and violence. Would you like, I mean, it was within a larger, you know, thread of thoughts that you were developing, and I don't know if it's just too short-sighted to pick out this one phrase, but I thought it was memorable. Would you like to go into it a bit?
Sure. Well, the claim that we were making, we want to make a claim for violence, and we want to make a claim on violence. And we want to make that claim in the name of a refusal of brutality. And as Stefano has said already, the force of regulative brutality has been directed towards the making of individuals. And again, individuals as persons, as products, as individual artworks, as institutions, as nation states, um, as identities. So so our interest is in breaking the and working against the force of that kind of individuation as it operates on multiple platforms. Um, the word mess in English is a great word. It's a useful word. It's got obviously it means something that purports to be irregular, not neat, rough edges, but it also is bound up with feast or festival. There's a Rabelaisian kind of notion of mess that we're invested in, and mess is close etymologically to mass. It implies not only eating and feast and festival, but more generally a rich modality of complex gathering. Um, it implies a gathering of differences, uh, a gathering of differences in which those differences are, to use a phrase that we've used before, in which those differences are militantly preserved against the brutal forces of individuation and separation. Um, so, uh, so the rich internal differentiation of mess and mass is what we want to advocate for, and what we would like to protect. And in this regard, self-defense wouldn't really be the right word for it, because there is nothing that has coalesced into a separable self here that should or could be defended. Instead, what's at stake would be a common defense, or maybe an undercommon defense of this gathering of differences. And we're interested in participating in that defense. And of course, the best way to participate in that defense is to practice it. Um, the defense of the mess or of the mass is most effective when it is given in and constituted by the practicing of that mass. So that the mass or mess that we're interested in defending is one that ultimately turns out to be a much more of a verb than a noun. Again, it's just not a thing that shows up even for the conceptual modality of individuation. It's a practice, right? That is defended by its continual practice. Okay. Mass implies, at least, within our sort of religious tradition, Catholic tradition, uh, which, Stefano and I both share in having largely disavowed it, but we claim it sometimes a little bit for our own nefarious, devilish purposes. But the celebration of the mass, the celebration of the mess is what we want to advocate. Um, there's no line between the practice and the celebration of it. And so what celebration implies is a kind of is a kind of exaltation, and also a kind of vehemence, a kind of enthusiasm. Uh, there's an enthusiastic, vehement pursuit of this gathering that we want to always honor and engage in. And if you do, if you engage in we've been interested in, we've maybe both probably fallen too much under the influence of Heidegger and his creative etymologies, but we are interested in the etymologies of words too. And the root of violence, the Proto-Indo-European root implies is a word that seems to denote a kind of vehemence, a kind of forceful pursuit of something. Okay. Uh, and similarly, it's interesting that that violence, that the roots of violence and of the violin, you know, are they brush up against each other quite closely. The violin, you know, comes from the Latin goddess for joy, Vitrula, you know. Often the word fiddle is even, some say, comes from that word Vitrula. It moves by way of the German. And when Vitrula, joy, a kind of celebratory exaltation. These are the sort of notions, the content that we would like to reinfuse our common understanding of violence with. Okay, and again, they're about messing up the individual, massing through the individual, massing through separation. Okay, a vehement celebratory practice of the constant disruption and disturbance of individuation. Okay, and its regulatory forces, which are so fundamental to the constitution of modern political economy, that, you know, that structures the conditions under which we don't live. Right. So this is kind of what it is that we're trying to do with, and this is a reason why it becomes important to describe violence. You know, you read all these books and people are talking about violence, but they don't describe it. They assume that we all know what it means, and they assume that we all know what it looks like, and then they leave out so many things that so many of us would call violent. Right? Like when Bill Clinton, you know, basically reformed welfare in the United States, right? If the term violence can't be applied to that act of policy, then there's something wrong with the term violence, and it needs to be reworked. Okay, that's where we begin.
Yeah, I would jump into that, but before, are you okay if we open for questions immediately? This doesn't mean that we can also continue here, but I want to say to the audience explicitly that you can participate in the discussion. There is people with mics over there. Can you show yourself? Yes, there's one person with one mic, and there will be, and you should raise your hand and participate. Yeah, so this is an open space now. And while you're thinking what you want to ask, I will ask something. But yes, so we bring people in. Fred, you give me so many occasions to ask something that I had in my mind before coming here. So this is, of course, beautifully to imagine the massing up of the disturbance, right? And this undercommon defense as a practice. And I had to think a lot, and you also mentioned Walter Benjamin, and that is why I want to jump in, about all these other notions of refusal, retreat, refuge, that I think are associated also with the things that you're thinking. And of course about something like what Walter Benjamin calls the general strike, as if you want, and it's also for him is a sacred kind of violence, is also another way of describing what we call it counter-violence with Marx, but I'm not sure if this is a good term anymore. So I would be interested in this. Could a general strike, this kind of sabotage, is this a refusal that we could also accept as a kind of undercommon violence, as a collective messing up.
Well, this is also the point maybe to say that, you know, some people are committing suicide, I'm sorry, slip there. Some people are committing sabotage just by walking down the street, you know, just by crossing the street in the wrong way. And more specifically, racialized bodies are, you know, constantly being read as sabotaging something. So the questions of refusal and sabotage, I think, first, you know, in the same way that we Fred and I used to talk about study, it's important to say this is already going on all the time. And it is precisely why we see so much, you know, unbridled and vicious brutality around us, which, you know, in our own country right now is taking the form of these mass shootings. But it's also, you know, as an aside, we're saying that as the mass shootings have mounted, the underlying fact of the anti-blackness behind these mass shootings has been almost erased by the fact that people who aren't black have started to get killed, right? But that anti-blackness is also ongoing evidence of, you know, something which Fred and I have talked about, which is the oldest anti-colonial movement in the world, you know, 400 years now, of Africans in the Americas, but particularly Africans in the United States, where the vicious individuation of that nation state has required ongoing anti-colonial struggle, and so also been intimately bound up with anti-blackness. And that question of sabotage and reactive brutality is the duress under which a lot of people have to think these questions of collective self-defense. I mean, sorry, did you want to get in, Fred?
Oh, well, I just wanted to say, I was going to say something about the general strike, but I can wait until you.
Maybe you shouldn't, you know what's going to happen. I'm going to go off on some tangent. So
Well,
why don't you give us that first, and then I'll come back to you.
Well, it's an interesting dilemma, because I think I want to go off on your tangent, you know? And if we get back to the general strike, it would be okay, but this might be something better, because, you know, my tongue is in your mouth, which is a violent formulation when Zora Neale Hurston says it. You know, a certain kind of violence is done to individuation when I think there's some shit that I got to say that's just really fucking important, but it might not be that goddamn important. It's probably more important that you go. And I would and isn't my willingness to submit there or to serve? See what I'm trying to say? So all of this it's all bound up, and it's like all got something to do with how you do the shit you do, you know. So you go, man. I'm good.
Well, the way I was headed off was, you know, just to, on the one hand, it's important, I think, always to, you know, remind ourselves that sabotage is already going on, but it's also producing unequal levels of brutality, according to who's doing it and under what circumstances. On the other hand, it's important to examine the easy way in which we feel like we can say, let's practice something else. You know, like every curator's favorite phrase is otherwise now. Every exhibit has otherwise in it, you know. But But it, it's not that easy, If we think about the other ways that we're bound up in individuation, if it was just a question of being able to say, if it was just imagining that individuation was a problem of ego, let's say, or a problem of thinking too much of yourself, or a problem of putting yourself before others, or any of those kind of bourgeois ideas of the problem of the subject, that wouldn't be that wouldn't be, insurmountable. But we're, okay, I'm going to branch this into two sides. On the one hand, we have to think about the history of the mode of individuation, right? We've talked about it as a brutal mode, but what is the actual mode? Fred and I have tried to explore this. It's a mode of trying to improve yourself. It's a mode of trying to develop your country. It's a mode of trying to say, I need to make a list today and get some things done, This mode, which not only is a seductive mode for all of us. It might not be seductive if you're able to say, well, I'm a banker and I know what I do is evil, so if I get better at it, I know it's bad, But what about if you're an artist or a teacher? What does improvement mean in those circumstances? What does efficiency, what does development mean to your practice? Well, what if those are utterly bound up with individuation? What if those are agents of individuation, modes of individuation? It causes a lot of problems for us when we try to address that. And then on the other hand, while we're encouraged by all these forms of improvement and development, which, suffuse everything from the art school to the business school, I'm a little hesitant to talk about logistics and algorithms here, because one of the great theorists of both is in the audience tonight, Matteo Pasquinelli. But I'll venture just into it a little bit. On the other hand, we have this constant assault on the notion that we are a subject or an individual, which occurs through all the ways logistics works through us, all the ways algorithms work on us, making us say, I got to get myself together again. I'm being accessed here, I'm being accessed in this way, I'm being led this way into new forms of behavior, etc. I need to get my subject back. I need to get back in place, right? I need to resist all this. And of course, the form that takes is this ridiculous proliferation of our subjectivity, like TikTok, right? So I'm saying all that to say, on the one hand, sabotage is going on, forms of refusal are going on all the time. On the other hand, we have to be careful not to think that it's easy to get out of this. And I think what I'm thinking about most especially is, I think we have to think in terms of the ongoing problems of complicity, the ongoing problems of failure, and the ongoing subject reaction that we're all vulnerable to, that causes us, in the moment of the greatest assault on this impossible fantasy of the individual, to fantasize all over again, fantasize even more deeply about this most destructive mode of being in the world. And that's what I think makes something that looks simple also be, need a constant struggle. I'd say.
Fred, no additions? And dear public, now we are going to impose a bit of violence to you. And yes, do you want to help us? We will wait for you a bit. You see, waiting works. There's...
Thank you. Is it on? Does it work? Hi, thank you so much. I kind of have more of a clarifying question. Just as you were speaking, I was wondering the ways that you were using individuation would probably be a way that I've maybe been using the term reification. And I was wondering if you see a difference in that, especially with relation to kind of the logistics of it all and the ways that things become, like something becomes a thing that then moves along the kind of infrastructures that you're speaking about. If you see, if you kind of see them as interchangeable, or if you would like to kind of speak to that in any way. Thanks.
Fred, maybe you want to take that up? By the way, I find it great also if we talk about the logistics and all incomplete questions, so feel free to leave the frame of violence also, right?
Well, no, it's an interesting question. I don't know if I know how to really answer it. In other words, the relationship between individuation and reification. Let's see. So, and you should, whoever asked the question, thank you, and please jump in the minute you hear me going wrong. But my sense of it is, so when I think about reification, I think about the ways that, Marx especially, and people in the tradition that he founds, are interested in the ways that processes and practices are displaced by that which they are supposed to produce, in ways that imagine something like the always already existing nature of that which is produced. So that the reification, the thingification, comes into its own fully when the process, or the historical processes and the productive processes that brought that thing into existence are hidden, and become obscure. And one way that we've been thinking about individuation, I suppose, is as a kind of offshoot or an extension or an exacerbation of the ways that maybe Deleuze and then his, teacher or inspiration, Simondon, have thought about individuation, which is to think about individuation as a constant process, right? To sort of reinitiate and reanimate the processual understanding of individuation, to uncover or to expose that process, to bring it back into existence, so that the individual, as it were, is understood to be as an effect of a constant, unending process of individuation, as opposed to being understood as the cause of this process. So we sort of, I would say that we're trying to operate within these two sort of bifurcating lines of that tradition of thought. Or in other words, we want to try to extend that Marxian line, but by way of the extensions of it that Deleuze and Simondon have already made. But I guess maybe the difference maybe between us and Simondon and Deleuze is that maybe we're not nearly as sanguine about the process of individuation as they are. And that we see this process as primarily as a mode of regulative brutality that manifests itself not only at the level of, social life and social existence. But it's also a regulative brutality that has, a genuinely deleterious effect within, the philosophical and the aesthetic realms as well. Um, that it's a regulative brutality that is visited upon sociality itself. And I guess maybe the other thing that would come into play is that often those who are most capable of offering resistance to the regulative brutality of individuation are those who have been, as a matter of policy and as a matter of sort of philosophical conceptualization, as well as the attendant modes of conceptualization that occur in the natural sciences and the human sciences, those who have been denied the status of individuation of individual. In other words, the ones who resist it most thoroughly and most successfully are the ones who are denied the very capacity to become individuals, at the same time as the brutal regulative forces of individuation are most powerfully visited upon those very people, right? And it's a complex historical sort of irony, but it's not so complex that you can't understand it. Um, and actually, this kind of leads me back to the point that I was going to make before, although it's not really a point now. It's like a question, Steve. And I feel like we're like asking everybody to indulge us as we think aloud together, because like this is really like a WhatsApp conversation kind of question. But I just thought of something and it's freaked me out, because if we think about the general strike, I mean, I was thinking there's this beautiful work, that Saidiya Hartman does on the general strike, extending Du Bois's understanding of the general strike from Black Reconstruction in America, and Eduardo Cadava and Sarah Nadal Melcio, his writing partner, are writing this really cool book called Politically Read, which is an attempt to really read Benjamin in relation to Du Bois on the general strike, and and in relation to Sorel and all that stuff. And I was thinking, well, it kind of comes back to the question you were raising, man, about complicity. Because let's say that the two most successful and powerful forms of the general strike coincide with what you called the most powerful and important forms of anti-colonial struggle, right? Which is the struggle of African peoples in the Americas against slavery. And I'm thinking here now of the Haitian Revolution as well as the Civil War and that mode that Du Bois calls Black Reconstruction in America, not only as a force that allows the North to win the Civil War, but that creates a whole new sort of set of structures of sociality in the years immediately following the Civil War. But what if it turns out that the intensity of their complicity was a conditional possibility of the power of their general strike? Because here's this, we never say, well, you wouldn't critique a slave for being complicit with the institution of slavery, even though he worked on the plantation, as Malcolm X said, from KC in the morning till KC at night. We would consider ourselves morally vulgar, right, if we accuse the enslaved person of being complicit. But we accuse ourselves of being complicit all the time, right? Even though our complicity is less in a certain sense as workers say. But what if it was the tightness of that complicity, right, which made the detonative power of their general strike all that much more, and I'm saying this because it's a historical irony that ought to give us pause, and it certainly freaks me out. You see? right? Because what it means is, because I'm not advocating that we go back to the days of slavery. Although in a different way, I'm advocating that we take up, the insights of Wilderson in a certain way, and even deeper, the insights of Burning Spear, and say we've never left the fucking days of slavery, really, right? And Hartman says this too. But what if it turns out, okay, that this kind of recognition, okay, of that complicity will have been, that the detonative power of the general strike is in direct proportion to the recognition of that complicity, right? Which is not a recognition of capitulation. It's a recognition of this interplay of complicity and antagonism, right? That manifests itself for the ones who could never fucking be individuals, you see, and who at the same time, in their complicity, never wanted to be, you know. Does that make any sense, man? I mean, this is really like an extension of the Felicity Street question, I think.
Well, yeah, I think it makes total sense, but also I think it, it also connects into these questions of violence and brutality, because I think it's what you've described is why so much of what goes on in the general strike could be characterized under the more intimate term of violence rather than under the term of brutality. And again, I think there's something for us in that, in the sense that we've spoken many times before about not getting hung up on complicity. But, as our old mentor Cedric Robbins would say, heighten and deepen the contradiction of complicity. And I think that goes especially for those of us in, with appointments or circulating in and out of art institutions and higher education institutions, et cetera, where there seems to be really kind of, a bit of an obsession with how you keep yourself clean from what is true about many art institutions and universities, that they're not very clean. And, we've often also pointed to, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and to some of our, people who inspired us in this movement in the United States in the late 60s and 70s in the car plants of Detroit. We often referred to General Baker, one of the leaders of this movement. And, some people might get up in the morning and say to themselves, I know it's wrong for me to teach at Princeton, because they had slaves, or they're reproducing the elite, or whatever else. But General Baker never got up and said, I shouldn't be working at the Ford Motor Plant. It just never occurred to him that he was going to be in any kind of situation other than a complicit situation. And because of that, he worked every day to destroy the place that he worked at, And we, unfortunately, have a tendency, and I include myself, work every day to strategize ourselves out of the institution.
There is someone there. Jihan, actually, is there.
Hello.
Footnote on collective complicity versus individual complicity. Maybe. Jihan.
Yeah. Hello. Well, first of all, I want to thank you both for the amazing body of work. Your distinction between violence and brutality, I think, is extremely appealing. But the more I think of it, the more I cannot see how one excludes the other, and why that clarity of distinction between one and the other is important for you. And how do we so neatly categorize brutality without violence and violence without brutality? And Okay, I don't want to ask two questions, but the whole idea of complicity, I think as Fred was talking and this whole idea of complicity and where the lines are, I couldn't help thinking of Amilcar Cabral and why a country like Guinea-Bissau stood up with its total incapacity to face up to its colonial power, and the idea was just about not allowing it to sit calmly and be able to think that they can continue doing it. And this is what happened. There is not a single liberation movement that actually won. What they did was allowed the colonial power to recognize that they cannot go on the way they did. So the truth is that independence was given because of the inability to continue a system. And that whole idea of complicity, I think, is really important. I don't know if I'm asking a question, but voila, the first one was a question. The second one is the idea of complicity being an essential factor in the perpetuation, and breaking that complicity even slightly is an act of resistance. Voila, maybe that was a comment, I don't know.
Well, it was a great comment, and I wish I were there so we could go out and drink afterwards so I could ask you a whole bunch of questions. But I would say, first of all, the distinction between violence and brutality. I mean, the question that you raise is really important because I believe that it causes us to try to refine our understanding of what a distinction is supposed to do, of how a distinction is supposed to work. And the distinction is generative if it never falls, if it refuses to fall into any kind of delusion with regard to its own purity. Right? So that the distinction between violence and brutality is generative if and only if it doesn't imagine itself to have established some absolute separation between violence and brutality. But rather, violence and brutality are entangled, or something like what one might call an entangled pair. It's just that by making that distinction, we become aware of and become able to think with a greater level. We become aware of things that the ordinary conception of violence does not allow us to become aware of. We become aware of how a bunch of things which ordinarily would not be conceived of within the same framework of violence are in fact violent, okay? Particularly around the question of policy. Okay? And by the same token, it allows us to, it requires us and allows us to see this fundamental interaction, as maybe Karen Barad would say, of violence and brutality. They one way to think about the way we want to understand violence is that it is a way of it is a constant refusal of this kind of conceptual purity. Now, with regard to Guinea-Bissau, and I mean, I know Stefano will have more to say than me about this, but maybe what's also at stake then is the necessity for another distinction, necessarily impure between something we wrote a while back, in which we just make it in the really, in almost a simplistic kind of way, a distinction between their complicity and ours. To be complete, that in other words, how much of anti-colonial struggle has been concerned with the dream of a non-complicity that ends up producing a kind of residual effect that is unintended, in which at the very moment that we seek to break the complicity with the colonial power, we also break the complicity with the people, right? This emerges as a problematic of leadership, or we've been studying it as a problematic of betrayal by under the influence of the late, sadly now late great George Lamming and the late great Andaya, two amazing Caribbean thinkers, and under the influence of Alyssa Trotz, who's another great Caribbean thinker who has helped to introduce the work of Andaya, especially to the world. But yeah, I mean, this is the problem, right? So how do we maintain a distinction, recognizing the dangerous proximity, okay, of the complicity that we share in anti-colonial struggle, right, with the complicity that, and what if it turns out that the complicity that we share in anti-colonial struggle, I mean, we know for a fact that it is constructed out of conditions of coloniality. All of this means that we have to work with great care and great precision in our practices to not to replicate somehow complicity with their institutions, while we maintain complicity with one another, while we maintain our capacity to be with and to complicity, come with, plea, fold, to fold with one another, to be enfolded, as it were, by one another in anti-coloniality, but against the grain of the brutal forms of individuation that constitute the essence of coloniality. I'm just blathering now because the questions are so rich, but Stefan, back to you.
I mean, it is a great question, and you know, one of the questions we've been asking ourselves as we've sort of thought of individuation in these other ways other than just as adhering to the person. We've asked this question: how did decolonization deliver the anti-colonial movement into the hands of the post-colonial elite who handed it to neocolonialism? Right. How did that happen? Yes, well, if you do, please tell me. But this is our question, right? And this is the question that George Lamming is facing, and Andaya, and people that are teaching us about it. But we do feel that one line of investigation with this regard is to think in terms of that moment of decolonization, which carried too many germs of coloniality with it. And particularly one of those germs was the germ of individuation, in the form, not necessarily in its direct form, but in the other forms: development, improvement, efficiency, many of the things that went along with a notion of individuality, and of course operated ironically, especially in the Portuguese colonies where they never did shit, right? But nonetheless, this not that we would be seeking, in opposition to that, a pure anti-colonial movement, of course, or a pure decolonization, but it's one of the reasons that we come back to questions like class suicide in Cabral, or to Huey Newton's notion of revolutionary suicide, because it strikes us that at that moment they were also perceiving this question. You know, when you think about class suicide, it is not something you can do by yourself, right? Now, we don't know if that was the answer, or if there's such a thing as an answer in those circumstances, but it feels like at that moment, there was an analysis by people like Cabral, or Newton, or many others, that there's something being carried along here because of the coloniality of these conditions, which is going to deliver all the bravery of the anti-colonial movement into the hands of people who think they have a right to be prime minister, you know, and who in fact went away to Oxford in order to come back to be prime minister, with every confidence that that's why they were being sent, and with plenty of complicity, because in a sense they were being sent, you know, by their quote-unquote people, you know. So these are all questions. It's a great question because we have no answers for it, you know. Anyway.
You can continue later in the bar. Because, dear everyone, we are here for 1.5 hours now. I don't know how you feel. Normally we would close this now. But you're free to pose a last question. Oh, there is 2 last questions. Let's have 2 of them and keep it short, everyone. Huh? Yes, because we want to also... So, there's 3 last questions. Yes, please. And here is 2 people here in the front. Can you have your hands up, please? Oh my God, now everyone wants to talk? Okay, I let you everyone talk, and whatever they want to answer then, you might also not be able to answer everything. Eh? But I think it's nice if the audience, yes, please.
Thank you, Fred and Stefano. I just want to hear something, if you could say something about some distinction or approximation between the notion of brutality and the notion of cruelty. What the notion of brutality does that the cruelty doesn't do. If you could, formulate something about that, and if it could be fruitful also to get a phenomenological description, as Fred said, of cruelty also, or it doesn't make sense. I don't know. I just want to hear you from these modalities of violence. If we could say something.
Thank you. Nice. Who is next? Yes,
Hi.
please.
Hi, thank you so much. I so appreciated the etymological riffs on violence and mass, and it strikes me that we didn't do the same with brutality. So I thought it might be helpful to hear a little bit about your thinking about how the origins of brutality, of the word brutality, influence the way that you think about it.
Thank you. Here, please, Jumana.
Hi. So, very quickly, I'm just wondering about the question of language in relation to self-defense and how violence in how did you frame it? Violence against brutality. It's very helpful in the context of settler colonialism. And it's something that we know very well, but often terms such as self-defense get appropriated and used then against us. And so I'm wondering if it's possible, or how it would be possible to think through a form or a language that is not so readily available for appropriation. And then maybe a part 2 of the question is also, how do we stop being in defense?
Yes, over there, please give it to her.
Yeah, thank you all. I will also try to be brief. I was wondering about individuation and mobility. I had to think about the fact that since you also talk about logistics and mobility so much, that the self, also thinking about algorithms and TikTok, if you will, is the thing that makes mobility right now. And I think we were thinking about it maybe from the other side a lot, but how do we deal with that as a resource, like the mobility of an individuated, integral self?
Nice. And I think
Hello, hi.
You're next.
So I was thinking a lot about the article I read for a class I did one time a long time ago, called The Emancipated Spectator, and one of the quotes that really stuck with me there was, the most violent thing you can do to someone is perceive them. And then that made me think about the social media world and how we all put ourselves on social media, and an extension of that, news and watching things all around the world. And I was kind of wondering if there was ever a situation in our modern day social media news age where we won't be perceived and there won't be a violent act on us. So yeah, I guess first of all, would you agree that the most violent thing you can do to someone is perceive them? And if there is ever a case where something won't be violent. Yes.
Okay, I think this was it. Bad timing, dear audience. Could have spread otherwise. But yeah, so you're free now to answer or maybe get inspired, resonate with stuff we heard. Cruelty, brutality, language.
Well, I'll try to get at a couple things, and then Steve can bring us home. Stefano can bring us home. Well, the interesting, where the etymology of brutality gets interesting to me is not the brutality that, not the part of it that seems to be fixated on some sort of assumed distinction between humanity and animality, so that the brute refers to the beast or the bestial. The part of it that gets me interested, that I think we're sort of kind of fixed on, is the part where maybe like there's a connection to some sort of Proto-Indo-European root that means heaviness, a kind of crushing, lead-footed, jack-booted heaviness, like a kind of way of stomping around on the earth, as if every step you took was an assertion of ownership, so that every step was designed to make a mark, to leave its tread, in that sense of great English poet Gerard Manley Hopkins talks about generations have trod, have trod, have trod, that 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 the brutality of man's steps, you know, you know, uh, that's the brutality that we're maybe trying to highlight and work against. And it's connected to cruelty in this way, I would say, where, cruelty is, it's like, maybe like a kind of tendency to make people suffer, where, I tend to want to, I don't know, slavery was often in the first instance conceived of as a really, really brutal and vicious way of denying people individuation. And sometimes I think that there's something kind of maybe not cruel, but certainly cold about the analysis that I guess we're trying to put forward. Who are we to you know, to try to say that it might be worth it to relinquish the individuation that has been so brutally denied, you know, for so long. Um, there's a coldness there, right? Like it, you know, it makes you have to you look at stuff in ways that it might be offensive to people. You know, you're like, well, the problem wasn't that Michael Brown was being denied his individuality. The problem was that when they shot Michael Brown, they conferred upon him his individuality, which is the gift of death. You know, you might say, well, God damn it, man, how can you say that shit? Could you say that shit to Michael Brown's mother? You know, you must be a cold, cruel, you know, and I'm like, well, yeah, I guess, you know. Um, I I don't, you know, I don't know. I I sometimes you think your way into saying a bunch of shit that you don't want to be the kind of person who could say it, you know. But that's why it's good to have a writing partner, because if you go to hell, at least you're gonna go with a friend, you know, kind of thing. But anyway, that's that's what I'm saying about those things and those parts of it. And just before I go, just want to say thank you again to Max and Margarita and to everybody in the audience, and let Steve wrap it up. So.
Thank you, Fred.
Well, there are a lot of rich questions, but I felt like maybe there's something I wanted to say that was connected to the question that you raised about can we ever not be in self-defense, but also this question about do we, you know, is there some way to talk that isn't going to be taken by them in this regard? But also in a way, maybe it's connected to the question that was raised about, well, about logistics and about bodies. Was it bodies, the term that you used? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to try to come around to this quickly, and but we do have a tendency to think we live in this very logistical age. You see lots of work on logistical capitalism and this and that, and in that frame, one of the things that we notice is that there's this intense attention to circulation, to how things get from here to there, to how we facilitate that, to how we're facilitated, to how we're accessed. In other words, that there's this incredible proliferation of means, how we do it. Doesn't matter, what the end is, but it's all about how we do it, how we move it, etc. And this is also applied to finance. But one of the things that Fred and I have often said is that actually what logistics is this tremendous degradation of means. It's taking the potential richness of how we might do things together and share things and circulate them, and directing them towards one end. And that one end may appear to us as profit, but at the end of the day, that one end is really man with a capital M. Everything in logistics is aimed at that idea that somehow, at the end of the day, there is a citizen and a subject who can develop and improve through the increasing efficiencies and elaborations of logistics and finance. But in fact, what we experience every day is a degradation of our capacities, and the kinds of capacities that I think are degraded most of all is what our friend Manolo Callahan calls our capacity to gather, our habits of assembly, as he calls it. And those habits are habits that, especially in settler colonialism, are most severely interdicted. In settler colonialism, the definition of the state is not a monopoly on violence. It's not a Marxist definition of the production of the public and privatization of wealth. The state is there to prevent us from gathering, and it always has been in any settler colonial environment. And part of the price of being prevented from gathering in the most severe conditions of settler colonialism, but then being told how to gather, you know, in contemporary places where settler colonialism appears invisible to some people, is that we've completely lost our habits of assembly. Our muscles have atrophied completely in this regard. In other words, our means are weak. They're fit only for the degraded means of logistics. And we have to get them back. We have to practice our habits of assembly. We have to practice gathering in our way, not in their way, you know? And when I say their way, what I mean is all the stuff that we were allowed to do. Everything from gathering in a classroom to marching on the street, you know? That's them. They say you can do that, right? Now, of course, we know underground and everywhere else, something else is going on all the time. But we need to practice it. These habits of assembly have atrophied, especially in the face of logistical capitalism, and especially in the face of the fact that settler colonialism, without denying its specificity, is a much more general condition today too. And that's what we're trying to do, you know. And if we sometimes use the word violence for describing our own forms of gathering, you know, it's like how much your muscles hurt after the first time you go to the gym, you know. There's something violent about doing it differently, you know. And keeping a distinction between that, which is not a separation, and the brutality of people allowing you to gather to go vote, is something we think is worth doing.
Yeah, thank you, Stefano. I'm very happy that we enriched the questions of violence so much today, that there is no purity. And I liked what Fred said about the undercommon defense for a gathering of differences that we need to preserve against the brutal regulation of individuation as celebratory exaggeration for mass disturbance, practice to gather our own way. Thank you for that, Stefano. Thank you for that, Fred. I want to also tell you, Denise Ferreira Silva is also another time this month in the program of HAU in our ecological series on racial Anthropocene, but not in Berlin. Is like we nomad somewhere else. You can hear the podcast of Denise Ferreira Silva of Burning Futures, and the next on violence will be in October with Maurizio Lazzarato on war and capitalism. So far, thank you, audience, for participating so much. Have a nice evening.